Hello and welcome to another edition of Wes's How-Tos. What we're going to do today is an installation of Windows Server 2008. One of the things that I get asked by far the most from a lot of my students, especially in my sophomore level classes, is, hey Wes, I'd really like to do some of this at home so I can practice. So I can try a few of these things, maybe before test time and really ensure I know what I'm doing. Sometimes it's hard to get into labs, sometimes lab hours are closed, things like that. And so it's really pretty understandable that a student would want to attempt to do a lot of the lab exercises and a lot of the tasks that are required for my courses at home. And I completely understand that thought. And so one of the problems that we had years ago was that you pretty much had to have another set of hardware laying around that you could install things on. And a lot of my kids are geeks at heart and have what they need at home, but not everybody. And so with the advent of today's newer technology, almost anybody has the ability and leftover power on their own desktop or even laptop to be able to perform some of these tasks through a technology called virtualization. And I know most of you have heard of that before. And essentially what virtualization is allowing us to do is use one current running subset of hardware, and what we're going to do is desktop-based virtualization. So what it does is it essentially is a program that allows us to virtualize or create duplicate virtual instances of all our hardware. And what that allows us to do is through a program like VMware Fusion, Parallels for Mac OS, Workstation of course is the VMware equivalent on a Microsoft PC, also open source solutions that are fantastic like VirtualBox. What they allow us to do is create virtual instances of all our hardware like I just mentioned, and essentially allow us to run a new separate operating system inside of our current operating system. It can be a confusing concept initially, but that's kind of the 10,000 foot view of it. It obviously is far more technical than that. But let's go ahead and get started. I think the best way to go ahead and do this is simply just to get started. And so what you can see right here is I have a image currently of Windows Server 2008. This is an ISO edition, and it is looks like if you look here, it's Windows Server 2008 R2, so we're going to go ahead and install R2. We've got, as far as the additions of Windows Server 2008 in this ISO, packed in are Standard, Enterprise, Data Center, and Web Edition. All of them come with Service Pack 1, and this is a volume license build. It's x64, which means this is a 64-bit kernel. It is a DVD release, so we could copy this to DVD if we wanted to. Now, just for anyone watching, if this is coming from where I'm teaching at Murray State, you're going to have access to this as a student in my classes. Now, if not, you'll need to purchase your own version of Windows Server 2008 or simply download a trial version. So when you begin your install, what you see initially may be slightly different than what I've got here. But don't let that bother you. We're just going to do a basic, well, for lack of better words, a vanilla install of Windows Server 2008. We're going to go with the Standard Edition. But I did want to outline to you the way that this ISO has been labeled so we can quickly and easily understand what's inside of it, what it is, what edition, what kernel release, and so forth. So let's go ahead and get started. My virtualization software of choice today is going to be VMware Fusion. I tend to like it quite a bit on Mac OS. But obviously I've used as well VirtualBox quite a bit as well, and really like that tool set a lot. It's a great virtualization platform. You can download it for free. Just Google VirtualBox, it'll come right up. Made by Sun, and it is an outstanding virtualization system. Now about VMware, this is of course made by VMware. They're kind of the industry standard in virtualization software, both on the enterprise and even at home and home use as well. So you can see right here I already have two VMs installed. I've got a Windows 8 64-bit, and I've got CentOS that you may have heard of, which is the Linux edition. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to install Windows Server 2008. Assuming I have the memory. I haven't checked before, so we're going to find out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and hit Add. Now let me say this. For those of you that may have a Windows-based desktop, some of this is obviously going to be different. You're not going to be using VMware Fusion. You'll probably use VMware Workstation or possibly VirtualBox. Either way is going to be no problem. But what we're going to do today is Fusion. So if you're on a PC, some of these steps initially are going to be slightly different, but I don't think you'll have any trouble finding out how to get to the point where we begin the install. So you may have to do a little bit of homework to get to that point. Okay, so let's begin. If you see down here, we do have about 50 gigs free of hard disk space, so we should be good to go. Oh no, I'm sorry, that's actually set for CentOS, and then we've got 10 megs specified for Windows 8. Don't know what's going on there. Anyways, so let's go ahead and hit add. And what we're going to do, we have some options here. We can import, we can migrate from, another PC or from our boot camp partition, which can be very, very cool. But in our case, we're just going to select new. So go ahead and do that. And now at this point it's saying, okay, we can do this. How do you want me to go about this? Obviously, since I'm using one of the brand new MacBooks with Retina, the mighty Apple has decided that DVD drives are, no longer essential. So whether you want to agree with that or not is beyond the scope of this video introduction. However, we don't have a DVD player. So this is why I have an ISO pre-downloaded and ready to go for us. But if you do have a disk rather than an ISO, that's no problem. My guess is that your software will automatically recognize that you have a DVD in and probably even see that it's ready to go as a Windows image. So some of you may have that from your textbook, which includes a trial 180-day version of Windows 2008. If that's the case, it'll probably just work right away. Okay, so what we're going to do is tell Fusion, hey, this is no problem. We don't have a disk in. We're going to specify an ISO later, so we're just going to say continue without disk. Okay. Now at this point we've got a couple different options. We can specify a disk or an image, and remember this ISO, I haven't mentioned this, but ISO essentially means this is a disk image. Okay, so we can use this, and this is the option we're going to choose. However, there are some other options as well. We could add to an existing disk. Now this is not relevant for us for what we're doing today, so I'm going to skip by this. Or we could create a new custom virtual machine, custom. And again, what we're going to do today, we're not going to discuss the other two options at this point. We may have another video series on this, but for us today, we're going to go ahead and use our first option. So obviously, what we need to do is choose which image we're going to go with. So I'm going to select it, and I'm going to say where it is. So as we know, it's here on my desktop, and here we go, and we're going to simply hit open here, and here we are. We're ready to go. So in this case, we have English Server Windows 2008, so on and so forth. See the big long name, and it does match up to what's here on my desktop, so we're good to go. So let's go ahead and hit continue. Now notice that it is smart enough to look at either the file name or the data inside, and it recognizes that it's Windows, and it's Windows Server 2008 R2 64-bit edition, which is exactly what we need. Now what this is important for is simply some of the initial install steps, but you don't necessarily have to have this pitch perfect. Do notice that we do have some other options here depending on what it is, so just be aware of this. But if you're using something just off FreeBSD or something like that and don't see it, don't panic. You should be still okay on an install. Okay, notice that we do have some other options here in case it read the disk incorrectly, but for us it was correct. So we're going to go ahead and keep that as our default option too. So if yours is not correct, you may need to set that as you need. Okay, now at this point we have some options. The easy install is nice because it takes away some of the initial options that just saves us some time. Kind of start it, walk away, come back, and does some things easier for you. However, we're not going to go that route. We're not going to use the easy install. We want to kind of go through custom and make sure everything is selected exactly the way that we want it. Also, I'm not obviously going to enter in a product key on this video, which makes obvious sense. So let's go ahead and hit continue. Now at this point it's basically saying, okay, listen, here's how we're going to do this. We are going to install Windows Server 2008, and we're going to allocate 2 gigs of memory. Now for us, for what we're doing as a video introduction, that is sufficient. You do need to be aware of how much memory your computer currently has. This machine, I believe, is running, let's say 8 gigs, I think. So 2 gigs should be more than sufficient, not only to run the operating system, but also not to tie down the resources on my machine as well. And so, if you're running a machine with, a host desktop with 4 gigs of memory, you might want to bump this down to 1 gig. If you run 16 gigs, and you might have the ability and availability to go from, instead of 2 gigs, maybe assign 4 gigs to it. But it also depends on how you're going to be using this operating system. Keep in mind, for this video, we're just simply installing Windows Server 2008. And in the future, if I use this image for further demonstrations, I'm not going to really tax this machine out. So to me, 2 gigs is enough. Really, same rule of thought, same logic goes with disk size. 40 gigs is enough for me. Now, if you're going to be virtualizing a machine and going to actually be using it in the enterprise, and it's going to become some kind of file server, something like that, it may need to be quite bigger than 40 gigs. So you need to make that call as well. Again, for me, this works. Now, networking. We've got shared networking, NAT for network address translation. Now, I'm not going to talk about that much in this video because it's not quite important, but I will have some more video series coming out that will detail all the differences between the networking types that we can select. And then notice for the CD/DVD, basically we're using this ISO. It says CD/DVD. Don't let that bother you. We are using this image that you see right here, but for all intents and purposes, it lists here, and this is the source that it's going to install from. Now, if you did want to customize, you can select here and do a couple things. One, we can choose exactly where we want to install to. I'm going to go ahead and put it under my documents under virtual machine, so it'll go right where CentOS and Windows 8 are, which makes a lot of sense for quite obvious reasons. And now let's go ahead and hit finish. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and, I guess, do what we did earlier, which I just brought up, and say, yep, the name is fine, looks good to me. So we hit save. And now what it's going to go ahead and do is bring everything up. So watch this. At this point now, because we are virtualizing, look at this. It looks almost, for those of you that may have installed Windows before, it almost looks, with the exception of all this desktop cut away, it looks as if we just turned a computer on with a disk in. It's reading right off the disk and getting ready to go. And really, largely, that is true. That's essentially what we've got going on here. So we can go ahead and wait. And what's happening right now is you can see this is running inside of inside of VMware Fusion. And so really this software that's running in here really has no idea that it's being virtualized. It does not know, this install right here does not know it's actually part of a larger operating system. And the reason for that is because VMware Fusion, again, is virtualizing all of the instances of my physical hardware and delivering it to this desktop, or I shouldn't say this desktop, I should say this server, as if it is its own individual hardware. Okay, so that's really what allows me to do this. And actually, we can even hold over some of these things and see some of the hardware that's being used. It's virtualizing my hard disk as a SCSI drive, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go over all of these because it's really not too important at this point. Okay, so here we go. We're ready to go. We're ready to begin the install. Now, just for your sake and mine, I'm going to go ahead and choose. I'm going to go ahead and full screen this. Okay, so this will just let us sees everything a little bit bigger and easier for you to see probably on the video as well. So we're going to go ahead and select our English US options. If you're watching this from another country, you need to change that. Go ahead and do that as you need. Now, one thing I always like to do, I do like to point out to my students. Look at this down here, this repair your computer. Sometimes this is very, very, very useful. Now, there are other ways that you can get to your repair partition or system partition to go ahead and change some settings. But this is one way that you can get right in. Now, we're not going to choose this right now, but I do make note that this is available right here, and this can be useful in the cases where your SAM file may get corrupted, perhaps your registry Hive gets corrupted. I have had situations like that before. Maybe a user forgets, my students will occasionally forget their administrator password. So these are nice ways that you can go in and go into your repair partition and essentially run what I like to call just low-level commands to make changes to your operating system. And it's very, very powerful, a little bit more complicated, but you can do some powerful things to recover your machine if you run into some kind of catastrophic failure. All right, we're not going to choose that though, and we're not going to talk about that right now, although we may later. Go ahead and hit install now. And now it's going to go ahead and begin the installation. So notice it says setup is starting. It's going to go ahead and start querying my hardware, seeing what's out there. Keep in mind all of this is virtualized. And it also is going to go ahead and look on the ISO or the image and say, hey, what do we have available here? So notice what I want to point out to you, we have a lot of different versions. We have Windows 2008, R2 Standard. We have both full and server core. Same with Enterprise, same with Data Center, same with Web Server. Now, all of this is Windows Server 2008 R2, Release 2. The difference between each of these is, first of all, each edition. We have Standard, Enterprise, Data Center, and Web Server. Now, we don't have time in this lecture to go through each of these and what the differences are between these, but they are for different purposes. It makes sense that we're going to go ahead and use Standard today, but later on we'll talk about the differences between Standard, Enterprise, Data Center, and Web Server. You need to know the difference, especially when you're making purchasing decisions. There's no need to purchase Data Center, for example, and Web Server will do the trick for you. The second thing I want to make note of is full installation versus server core. Essentially what Server Core is a far more stripped down version of Windows. It's very akin to running a non-graphics version of Linux. In my opinion, Microsoft really took a smart decision here and kind of took a page out of Linux and Unix's book and saying, you know what, there are instances where we don't need a full-blown operating system. And there are many cases where a Server Core installation, which is essentially non-graphics and more stripped down, is more suitable as a replacement. And keep in mind the thoughts behind this are twofold. First of all, it's going to be faster. The less you have running, the faster it's going to operate. Secondly, a nice thing about Server Core is that it has, again, when we strip away a lot of the unnecessary things like graphics, essentially we're stripping away code. What do we know about code? The more code that is existent on our machine, the more space, the more possibility for vulnerabilities. And so the more we can strip away, the better off we're going to be, statistically speaking. Okay? So we're going to go with full installation, all that being said. So let's go ahead and hit next on this, and we have Microsoft's typical EULA and user license agreement. We can scroll through and read this. I am not going to tell you to do that. I know very few people that are interested in this, even lawyers. So not to say it's not useful, not to say it's not binding. Both of those are true. We're just going to go ahead and accept it. Now at this point we have the ability to upgrade or do a custom installation. In many cases this upgrade will be ghosted out, especially if you're starting on a drive with no data on it. Perhaps it's been formatted and clean. This may be ghosted out. Okay. However, it may not be ghosted out if you already are running, let's say, Windows Server 2003 and ready to upgrade from 03 to 08. Okay. However, for us, we're going to go ahead and do a custom installation. Now, notice for us, we had already specified that 40 gigs was enough. Do you remember earlier in our custom initialization we specified 40 gigs? You remember that? Well, guess what? This has been delivered, 40 gigs. So when this install comes up and when VMware Fusion is virtualizing our hardware, part of what it does is it says, hey, you've got a hard drive and you have 40 gigs. Now, actually have far more than 40 gigs available on my MacBook Pro, but we are giving to it 40 gigs is what we're saying it has available. Okay, so that's why this is showing up as saying, hey, I see a 40 gig drive. It's actually bigger than that, but this is my virtualized drive that I said you get 40 gigs worth. We could hit drive options here and look at some of this. There are some cases where we may want to specify perhaps 2, 3 different partitions, something like that. So let's go ahead and go assign one partition. Let's say in this case if we have 40 gigs available, let's go ahead and assign 30 gigs to it. Okay. So we're going to say 30,000 megs, which is 30 gigs, and hit apply. And it's going to say, hey, in order to make sure all this is going to work correctly, we might need some additional partitions. All right, sounds good to me, Microsoft. And look what it did here for us. Okay. In this case, we now have partition 2, and we have our 30 gigs assigned, 29.2, close enough, right? Then we have unallocated space, about 10 gigs. Add these two up, comes out to about 40 gigs, doesn't it? Pretty close. Now also notice we have a 100 meg system reserved partition. Okay. We will talk about the use for this later. One of the big uses, though, of course, at least to say this quickly, is this is basically just a system partition that we can use to have some data on for recovery purposes, for boot up purposes, some things like that. Okay. Now notice that this is ghosted out. If I try to install Windows to disk partition 1, 100 megs, not going to work for obvious reasons. There is no way we can install Windows Server 2008 on 100 megs. You know that, I know that. Secondly, notice that we could attempt to install it on this unallocated space, but it's giving us a warning. It's saying, hey, listen, I can do this, but we really need close to 13 gigs to do this. So let's go ahead and select partition 2. Notice this is the primary partition. This is the system partition. In another lecture, we'll talk about the differences between these two. Okay, so at this point we can kind of sit tight and wait. What we've got going on here is we have begun the install. And so at this point it is copying all the files, it's expanding everything, and then it's going to begin the installation. Now again, remember all of this in my case is coming off an ISO, so this actually will be pretty quick for me because we're going to have faster read-write speed than off a DVD. If you are installing off a DVD instead of an ISO, this may take a little bit longer, and that's okay. Don't worry about that. So what we're going to do is we're going to come back here and resume this video when we get to about close to 100%, and we'll come back. That way I don't have to make you wait through all of this. Okay, so here we are. We're back to about 95%, so it's a good time for us to pick back up on this video as we begin finishing the expansion of our Windows files. So here we are at 100%, and so now it's getting ready to actually begin the install. Everything has been unpacked from its compressed formats, and it's beginning to go ahead and do the install. And notice this, at least on this machine, is really pretty quick. Again, installing off an ISO really can be a lot faster, especially if your drive has fast read-write speeds. So it's going to go ahead and attempt a restart. And here we go. Notice we saw that VMware logo, which is kind of the front end in between the actual operating system and the hardware. It's again the virtualization component. Some people call it the hypervisor. And so here we go. We see the Microsoft little loading screen right there, and Windows Server 2008 is beginning the actual reboot process. So made a couple registry changes, and now back to this window again. Completing installation is going to finish up, clean up a few things, and we should be ready to go on our version of Windows Server 2008. Okay, so we see now Windows is beginning what they're calling our first use. So we see this nice snazzy little light peeking through something or other. And here we go. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is go ahead and create our password. So in this case, on this machine, we're going to go ahead and give it a pretty weak password, to be quite honest with you. In most of our classes in our labs, we don't use the most elite of passwords. We either use admin pass, all lowercase, or in this case, since this is Windows Server 2008 and we have the password restrictions pre-installed, we need to go ahead and create a little bit of a more secure password. So we're going to use admin pass 1. We're going to use the capital A and the number 1. So admin pass 1, the capital A at the beginning, and the number 1 at the end. Obviously an extremely weak password, just as admin pass was before it, but Microsoft is requiring us to have a little bit of a better password with the new version Windows 2008 and the password complexity requirements turned on, which is essentially 8 characters, and then a combination of one of the 3 of the 4 of uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and symbols. So that's really what it's requiring for us. So admin pass 1 gets it for us. It says your password's been changed and we're ready to log in. Now keep in mind the default user account in Windows is administrator. For Linux, it's root. So do keep that in mind if you're more of a Linux kind of background person. All right, now at this point, Microsoft presents us this initial configuration task. Now this is a nice window to have when you start up. Many times in an enterprise environment, a lot of these changes, if not all of these, are going to be preset, handed through group policy and scripts. But in this case, since we're just kind of doing a vanilla simple install, I want to walk you through a few of these options here so we can make sure we have everything set the way that we want it. So first of all, for Windows activation, I'm going to skip that for right now. I haven't entered in a product key. I'm not going to do that on this video, not necessary. First of all, though, let's go ahead and set our time zone. On a server, it is extremely important that we have accurate, up-to-date time. Now notice here, this is the timestamp it's delivering to us. One thing that you may want to check is see, first of all, what time zone we're on and set that as it is according. Now here, where our location is, we're on Central Time. So I'm going to go ahead and change from Pacific Time, I think is what it was currently, and move over to Central Time for me. Another thing that we can do is we can look here and ensure this is correct, which we're just going to go ahead and say it is for now. We do want notification of clock changes. And then the other thing that we're going to do is make sure that we are set to synchronize on our time. We can change our servers if we need to. Sometimes people don't want to use Windows, they use NISTs, or they'll use even their own internal one, and that's fine. If your internet is currently working, you can hit update now, and it should work, and go ahead and update. Now let me go ahead and say this. It's important to have accurate time, because when we are working on debugging problems on a server, or we're working with maybe post-incident, maybe some kind of network compromise, something like that, it is vital that we have accurate, synced up times within a second or two. And the reason for this is if we're trying to correlate logs across multiple machines and routers and all these sorts of things, if we have even one machine that's off on its time skew, it can completely throw off our information. It can make it perhaps inadmissible in court. It can make it difficult to track down and actually see what's going on. It can simply make something not show up correctly in our logs. If we have some kind of intrusion detection based on logging and something is off on its time, it may not throw a flag. So it is critical with servers that we have up-to-date, accurate time. And so that's why I wanted to spend a lot of time here on this time zone setting. Now, configure networking. In this case, VMware has only delivered to me one network, but actually, just so you know, it is possible for VMware Fusion and most of the other virtualization platforms as well to deliver over to Windows more than one network card. Okay, and there are many cases where we do this. When I teach firewalling, we need at least 2 network connections on a Linux box. So there are many cases where we would need more than one. But I just delivered one to it. We can change that if we need to in another video in Linux. I'll show you how to do that when that's pertinent. Now let's go ahead and look at the properties here. So notice here we have IP6 and IP4 both installed. If you don't know the difference between the two, don't worry about it too much. Currently we're going to be using IP4. So I'm just going to go ahead and unselect IP6 so that none of my users may accidentally try to configure this. And then let's go to IP4 and hit Properties. Now notice, remember I had told you before that we're using a NATed connection and a shared internet connection, and this is the setting that VMware is giving to this virtual machine. So for that reason, I can go ahead and have an automatically assigned IP address. However, there are many cases on a server where we may want to use a statically assigned IP address. Now I know most of you at home, on desktops at work, DHCP with a dynamically assigned IP address as we have set here is a good way to go. However, on a server, there are many cases where we may want a manually, statically assigned IP. However, we're not going to do that. At this point, we're just going to go ahead and leave it automatic. But you may need to change this statically to what you need. Okay, so just wanted to mention that. All right, so everything is pretty much good to go as we have it. The only thing I did is deselect IP6, which is not critical at this point. And then what we need to do now is go ahead and give the machine a computer name. So in lab, all of our physical machines in our labs are already pre-labeled. And so I have my students just match the name with what's on the label of the actual physical computer. In this case, since we're virtualizing, maybe not as important. Okay, so here we have our computer name. And this was randomly assigned by our installation. So we probably want to change this to something different. And I always tease all my fellow IT guys because we are known as computer people for not being exactly the most creative people in the world. But one way that we do get pretty creative is coming up with computer names. We've had multiple naming mechanisms at my university. I'm not going to talk about what those are right now on this video. But let's go ahead and create one. Let's call him Frodo. Okay, so those of you that are any Lord of the Rings or Tolkien viewers, readers will know where this is coming from. So this machine is just going to be called Frodo. Alright, so it says, alright, we can do this, but we've got to restart, hearkening all the way back to the Windows 95 days. And we say, yes, of course, I've been using Windows for a long time. I'm used to this whole restarting thing. And so essentially what we have to do in this case is, since we have changed the computer name by which it's referred to, we need to restart the machine. There are some changes that require a restart. So notice this was actually pretty quick. Now on a virtual machine, a lot of times on a physical machine, first of all, let me say it this way. Normally we have to press Control-Alt-Delete to log in. This is the signal that says, hey, a user is logging on. The problem with a virtual machine is that oftentimes a Control-Alt-Delete will not work because it's expecting that on the actual host machine. So if you press Control-Alt-Delete on your virtual machine and it doesn't do anything, don't panic. It's not because your keyboard isn't working. It's probably because the Control-Alt-Delete is being used usually for your host machine, not your virtual machine. So what you can do is you can go and look, and a lot of times you're going to see on your options on your virtual machine the ability to send a Control-Alt-Delete signal. So I'm going to take full screen off and I'm going to show this to you. All right, we should have this as an option as well. And I guess you can't see it on this video, but I'm going to go ahead and click the send Control-Alt-Delete signal, and it sent it now virtually, and now we're ready to log in. So here we are, logging in. Our desktop is good to go, and we can go ahead and assume everything is the same except our computer name got changed. Let's go ahead and confirm it. Notice here it shows that we don't even have to click because it says full computer name Frodo, and the work group is work group. Now we're going to leave this. We are going to promote this machine into a domain controller later, but at this point the work group option is just fine. Okay, some other things that you may want to check on, and I'm not going to spend any time on this right now on this machine in this lecture, but we may want to consider how we handle automatic updating, feedback. A lot of times for Security purposes, we may be very careful on how we allow Microsoft to accept any of our data. Of course, it says, this information collected is not used to identify or contact you or your company. We're not going to have a debate right now over the merits of that, but we have seen in the past plenty of companies, cough Google, that have in some cases said, hey, we're not really doing anything that's going to identify you, and later on from privacy advocacy groups we find out they do. So you can find out more about this later, but suffice to say, usually your own enterprise is going to have written authenticated documentation on how you handle this. So for now, I'm just going to close this and not make any changes. And then we can also update our machine. Now let me say this, in a production environment, it is critical that we update. And there are ways that we update. There are methods that we have to make updating easier and enforced and authenticated. But for us, we're going to also ignore this for now as well. Okay, we will come back to this later. And then now we have the ability to go ahead and do some things here. We can add roles. We can add features. We'll talk about what these roles and features are in a later lecture. But I can let you go ahead and look through some of these now and just see some of the options and availabilities that we can use to further customize our Windows Server. Because remember, at this point, here's Windows Server, right? Yay, rah, rah, rah. We've got our Windows Server. Here it is. It can do some things. But really, honestly, right now, it's not doing much more than a desktop is doing until we add some roles and or features. So let me go ahead and show you some features. Here are some features. And basically, there's a lot of new software additions that we can install to give us more control as well. So there is a difference between roles and features. We'll talk about those in another lecture as well. We can enable or disable remote desktop. I definitely prefer it being disabled at this point, although there are many cases where we want a Windows Server to accept remote desktop, and we would control through group policy who can access it and from what times and from where they can access by remote desktop. And then also Windows Firewall. We'll go ahead and leave Firewall on, but at one point in our class we will need to turn the firewall off for some of the changes that we'll make, but generally speaking we want our Windows Firewall to be on. Okay, so at this point we've gone ahead, we've installed Windows. We haven't activated, but we did get our time set correctly. We did configure our networking, which was already correct, and then we have set our computer name, provided a restart, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and close this window. At some point you may just want to click right here and say do not show this window at logon for the future, for future reboots, and this comes up and you don't have to specify it. But for now I'm going to go ahead and close it. I'm not going to check that because there may be times when I want this to come back up. Now keep in mind, just because we may close this doesn't mean I can't make these changes. You can always go to the control panel and change every single one of these options here. But this nice initial configuration task is a nice way to just quickly go through some of those steps and make sure you don't miss anything. Okay, the next thing that we get is our Server Manager that comes up. I'm a big fan of Server Manager. This is new in Windows Server 2008 and really, really, really nice. Very easy to scroll through to look at some of the things that we may need, quick to make changes to. Very nice for seeing our roles and features. Now again, remember, I don't have any installed, but I can click on either of these and add them if I need to. Diagnostics right here in front of you, so we can see our full logging on our Event Manager, or Event Viewer, I'm sorry, which is very nice. We have performance information. Our Device Manager is easily accessible. If you remember, basically all these tools that you're seeing here in the Windows 2003 and prior days, all of these were available, or at least most of them, under the Administration Tools segment of your machine. If you go and look under Control Panel, you would see most of these here. However, Microsoft has done a great job at kind of adding and conglomerating all these together under what's called Server Manager. We can also see configuration for our disks, for users and groups, tasks, firewall, things like that. And then we have storage information as well, so we can handle management on our actual disk. You can see our partitions, the CD-ROM that it's showing here, even though, again, remember, we don't have a real CD-ROM drive on here. It's virtualizing, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close this out. And here's our server. The last thing that I usually have my students do, just to confirm that everything is working, is go ahead and bring up your command prompt and try a ping. Go ahead and try and ping something to make sure your machine is actually up online. So let's just do the classic ping www.google.com, and notice that we're getting a reply back. So essentially what this ping is doing is it's sending out an ICMP packet. If you don't know what that is, don't worry about that at this point. It's just a packet that goes out from our computer and tries to get out to whatever source or destination, I'm sorry, that we specify, and our destination is Google. Okay, so it worked. Another thing that you might want to do is check your network settings. So notice here is our IP settings. 192.168.251.132 is my IP, and my gateway, and so on and so forth are all set. we can see some of our other information here. Again, we're not gonna get into this right now, but do notice we do have an IP set and we are able to ping out, so we're good to go. I'm gonna go ahead and exit out of this, and we can confirm that our operating system has been installed. We can confirm that it has network connections, and we can confirm that some of our basic configuration tasks were completed. So hopefully this video will give you enough information to go ahead and start an install and configuration of your own Windows Server 2008 machine at home. And hopefully also by watching this video you realize, you know what, this actually wasn't that intimidating at all. This is actually pretty easy. I can do this. Now obviously the complication can get scaled up when you're doing an install to multiple machines at once rather than one at a time, but at least from the basic settings it's really quite easy. So let's go ahead and shut the machine down. Start. We can log off, but in this case we don't want to do that. I'm going to go ahead and hit shutdown, and notice now we need to give it a reason for a shutdown. On a Windows server we typically don't want to just shut down. Usually we want our servers to be running 24/7 if we can get away with it. So because we need to shut it down, it's saying, hey, you need to give me a reason for this. Again, on a Windows on a virtual machine, on a test machine, a learning machine, it's probably very common that we're going to shut it down, but in a real enterprise, not very often. So we would want to give a reason for it, and notice they have some pre-canned ones, planned, unplanned kind of idea here, and then we can simply give it a reason. Usually I just tell my students throw something in, but it does show up in the log. So if, again, in an enterprise machine, you'd want to give it a reason. So maybe something, a reboot for hardware changes, maybe RAM. You might even reference this to maybe something in an event log or some kind of logging mechanism that ties back to exactly what happened and when and why and how. So at this point you have seen your installation of Windows Server 2008 and configuration. I hope you enjoyed this video, hope you learned something, and hope you're able to do this on your own at home.